There's a particular kind of courage that nobody writes songs about. Not the charge across open ground with a rifle and a battle cry. Not the pilot fretting through flak at 30,000 feet. This is a quieter courage, colder in its logic, almost administrative in its clarity. It belongs to the man who climbs into a steel box knowing, with mathematical certainty, that if one enemy soldier gets close enough, if one armor-piercing round finds the right angle, if one satchel charge lands in exactly the wrong spot, he will not burn to death so much as detonate. He will become the fire. He knows this. He checks his gauges, confirms his fuel pressure, pulls the hatch shut behind him, and tells himself nothing at all. The men of the 713th Armored Flamethrower Battalion knew precisely what they were sitting on. 290 gallons of napalm thickened fuel, compressed air tanks humming under pressure, a flame gun protruding from the turret where a 75mm cannon used to be, 3 CO2 fire extinguishers mounted inside the crew compartment, 3 small bottles of pressurized gas against 290 gallons of incendiary liquid, and every man understood that those extinguishers were there for reasons that had nothing to do with putting out a serious fire. They were there because the Army had put something in the manual, something that implied, however unconvincingly, that a crew inside a burning Zippo tank had options. They didn't have options. What they had was a weapon that changed the Pacific War in ways that naval artillery and aerial bombardment and infantry courage could not. What they had was the one thing that reached where nothing else could reach, into the black mouths of caves carved from volcanic rock and coral, down into tunnel systems that bombers couldn't touch and artillery couldn't crack, and foot soldiers died trying to approach. What they had, in the language of the men who feared it most, was the last word in any argument. The Japanese soldiers who heard the mechanical grinding of a Zippo tank coming up the ridge had a name for what happened in their chests when that sound reached them. We don't have their exact words, but we have something better. We have the record of what they did, how they ran, how they surrendered, sometimes in groups of hundreds, when they never had before, how 16 men pressed grenades against their own stomachs and detonated them simultaneously rather than face what was coming, how entire defensive positions that had absorbed naval bombardments measuring in the thousands of tons simply crumbled, not because of superior firepower in any conventional sense, but because of a weapon so visceral, so immediate, so absolutely unambiguous in what it meant, that it broke something in the calculation of even the most dedicated defenders. Before any of that could happen, though, someone had to build the thing. Someone had to decide it was worth building. And before that, the Army had to stare into the face of a problem that was killing its soldiers by the thousands and admit that none of the weapons it already had were equal to it. The problem had a name, and the name was the cave. Understand what the Imperial Japanese Army had spent the better part of 2 years constructing across the islands of the Central and Western Pacific. And you begin to understand why an engineer in New Caledonia started looking at a flamethrower and a tank and asking if they could be made into one thing. On Iwo Jima, an 8-square-mile volcanic island that smelled of sulfur and offered almost no natural cover, Japanese engineers had carved 11 miles of reinforced concrete tunnel beneath the rock. 11 miles. The tunnels connected command posts, ammunition depots, medical facilities, and firing positions in an interlocking system so well designed that American naval artillery, which fired 22,000 shells in the 3 days before the landing, destroyed almost none of it. The shells hit the surface, and the Japanese were underground. They emerged after the barrage, walked to their positions, and waited. On Okinawa, which was larger and more heavily fortified, the tunnel and cave systems were even more elaborate. Ridge lines riddled with firing ports, with tunnels running through the interior hills, so that defenders could shift from one face to another without exposing themselves, with natural cave systems reinforced and expanded and stocked with enough supplies for months of fighting. What do you do with a problem like that? The standard answer in 1943 was this: you hit it with everything you have until it stops shooting back. Artillery, naval gunfire, aerial bombardment, tanks firing high explosive, infantry crawling forward with rifles, grenades, and increasingly portable flamethrowers. The results were consistent and terrible. Artillery couldn't depress its angle enough to reach most cave entrances. Naval guns punched holes in hillsides, but didn't penetrate the tunnels behind them. Bombers dropped their loads on coordinates that were often wrong. And even when they were right, the deep rock absorbed the blast. Tanks firing high explosive could suppress the mouth of a cave position, but the defenders were deep inside, and once the tank passed or pulled back, they came to their guns again. The portable flamethrower worked. When a man could get close enough to direct a stream of burning fuel through a cave entrance or a bunker aperture, the results were immediate and irreversible. The problem was getting close enough. The M2 flamethrower weighed 60 pounds loaded, required the operator to close to within 30 or 40 yards of the target, produce a brilliant orange flame visible from every direction for hundreds of yards, and had to be held steady and aim with precision while under fire. In a different environment, that might have been manageable. In the Pacific Island fighting of 1943 and 1944, where every piece of ground in front of every defensive position was zeroed in by machine guns, mortars, and snipers trained to watch for exactly that orange glow, the portable flamethrower operator's life expectancy was measured not in days, but in minutes. For minutes was the figure that circulated. For minutes from ignition to casualty. Men carried them anyway, because the alternative was accepting that some positions simply couldn't be taken, and the Pacific War did not permit acceptance of that proposition. What was needed was the flamethrower's reach combined with armor that kept the operator alive long enough to use it. The first person to seriously pursue that combination was a man whose name the Army's official records seem almost determined to obscure. Somewhere on New Caledonia in the late summer of 1943, accounts point toward Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hart of the 754th Tank Battalion, though the record hedges even on this. An officer looked at an M3A1 Stuart Light tank sitting in a motor pool and asked an engineer a question that would eventually save more American lives than almost any other tactical innovation of the Pacific War. The question was simple: can we put the flamethrower inside the tank? The first attempt was almost comically impractical. The M3A1 Stuart had a two-man turret with barely room for the crew, let alone 60 pounds of extra equipment. Fitting a flame gun to the pistol port meant the gunner was operating in conditions somewhere between difficult and impossible. Maneuvering a long steel tube in a space where you could barely lift your elbows, try to aim through an opening the size of a dinner plate, while the tank was moving and the enemy was shooting at you. The fuel tanks, 2 5-gallon units borrowed from the M1A1 flamethrower, gave 20 seconds of burn time total. 20 seconds. After which the tank had to return to the rear to refuel. None of this was good enough, and everyone knew it. But the concept was sound, the need was undeniable, and the fighting on New George in the summer of 1943 had made both of these things very clear to very senior officers who had very personal reasons for wanting a solution. The work continued. On Bougainville, on January 30th, 1944, the improvised tank flamethrowers of the 754th Tank Battalion went into combat for the first time against a Japanese defensive complex so thoroughly entrenched and overlapping in its fields of fire that the troops who'd been trying to break through it for 10 days had named it the Hornet's Nest. In a day's fighting, with M3A1 Stuarts pumping 20-second bursts of flame between trips back to the fuel line, 14 of the 28 large bunkers in the Hornet's Nest were credited to the tank flamethrowers. The infantry said they couldn't have done it any other way. The Army began paying much closer attention. What followed was 2 years of iteration, modification, and increasing urgency as the island-hopping campaign moved toward Japan. The improvised Stuart-based systems gave way to dedicated auxiliary flamethrowers mounted in the bow positions of Sherman tanks. The Chemical Warfare Service's Hawaii office adapted the Canadian Ronson flamethrower system to M3A1 turrets. These machines, nicknamed Satans, went to Saipan and Guam in the summer of 1944 and proved themselves again. With each iteration, the range grew, the fuel capacity grew, the burn time grew, and the crew's confidence in weapon, though never in their own survival, if the fuel went up, grew with them. By the time the Navy Seabees finished modifying the M4A3 Sherman with the Mark I flamethrower system, the result was something qualitatively different from everything that had come before. The 75mm main gun was removed entirely. In its place, fed by 290 gallons of napalm thickened fuel stored in pressurized tanks that wrapped around the crew compartment like a steel embrace, was a flame gun capable of projecting a burning stream to a distance of 150 yards. Not 20 seconds of burn time, but up to 80 seconds of sustained fire. Not a bolt-on improvisation, but a purpose-built weapon installed in the turret of the most reliable tank in the American arsenal, protected by the Sherman sloped armor, carried on tracks tested against every terrain the Pacific could offer. The troops called it the Zippo. The name came from a lighter, the same logic, the same immediate association. Point it and it burns. But there was a second, less cheerful interpretation that the crews understood without saying it aloud. A Zippo lighter, flipped open carelessly near spilled fuel, doesn't just light a cigarette. It creates an event. The crews sitting inside 290 gallons of napalm did not need to be reminded of this. 8 of these machines landed on Iwo Jima on the morning of February 19, 1945. For the first day of the landing, they weren't used. The Marines were fighting to establish a beachhead, pushing through black volcanic sand that swallowed the treads of standard Shermans and turned every yard of advance into a physical argument against the ground itself. The flamethrower tanks sat in reserve, their crews listening to the sound of the battle organizing itself into something coherent. On the second day, they moved forward. The Japanese on Iwo Jima had been preparing for this assault for a full year. General Tadamaki Kuribayashi had designed his defense around one central principle. Do not waste men defending the beach. Let the Americans land, let them gather, and then, from positions they cannot see and cannot reach with conventional weapons, kill them. The beach itself, where Marines expected the fiercest resistance, was almost lightly held. The real fighting was up in the volcanic rock, in the tunnel-connected pillboxes and bunkers and cave systems that covered every approach to Mount Suribachi and the airfields to the north. When the standard Sherman tanks tried to engage these positions, the results were instructive. High explosive rounds fired at bunker apertures churned up the rock around the openings and sometimes suppressed the fire temporarily. But the defenders were deep, and the physical construction of the positions meant that even a direct hit on the opening didn't necessarily reach them. Grenades thrown from infantry attempting to close on foot were often dropped short by fire from positions the throwers never saw. Satchel charges worked, but delivering them meant getting close enough to be in the kill zone of the position you were trying to destroy, which was the entire problem. The Zippos moved up. A Marine captain named Frank Caldwell, commanding officer of a company in the 26th Marines, watched from a forward position as one of the flamethrower Shermans closed to within 150 yards of a fortified cave position that his men had been trying to neutralize for hours. There was a pause. Not long, just long enough for the crew inside to confirm their target, confirm their angle, confirm that their infantry screen had cleared a line of fire, and then the weapon spoke. What came out of the Sherman's turret was not, technically speaking, a flame. Not at the moment it left the muzzle. It was a pressurized stream of thickened napalm, a substance with the approximate consistency of burning gel, designed specifically not to splash or scatter, but to flow and cling. It flowed at 150 yards range, and it went into the cave opening, and then the cave answered with a light that had nothing to do with the sun. The Japanese soldiers inside did not wait to die in place. They came out. This was what the intelligence officers noted in their after-action reports, and noted it was something approaching bewilderment, because Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima had demonstrated repeatedly and at appalling cost in American lives that they would not abandon their positions under any circumstances that conventional weapons could create. They absorbed naval bombardments of a scale and intensity unprecedented in naval history and returned to their guns. They absorbed artillery, aerial bombing, tank fire, and infantry assault and fought on from positions they'd been ordered to hold to the last man. Surrender was not a concept that circulated among them in any practical sense. The flamethrower tank created a practical sense. Captain Caldwell watched it happen, and then he filed a report, and in that report he wrote, "In my view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won this battle. 8 machines, on an island defended by 22,000 men in 11 miles of tunnel. 8 machines, and a Marine captain who had seen everything Iwo Jima had to offer said this was the one that won. The flamethrower tanks doused the island with roughly 10,000 gallons of napalm every day of the 36-day battle. The crews rotated through their vehicles, fueled and pressurized, and went back in again and again. The positions they couldn't reach with their first pass, they returned to. The tunnels that ran too deep for a direct frontal shot, They worked from angles, seeking the secondary entrances, the ventilation shafts, the places where the mountain breathed. What the Japanese engineers had built in a year. The Zippos unmade in increments, cave by cave, tunnel mouth by tunnel mouth, position by position. And every time a crew climbed back in, they were climbing back into 290 gallons of napalm, knowing that the enemy had identified them as a priority target. Knowing that every Japanese soldier on the island understood that killing a Zippo tank was worth whatever it cost. Suicidal infantry attacks, specifically targeting the flamethrower tanks, were documented throughout the battle. Men with satchel charges and grenades running at the machines in the clear knowledge they couldn't survive the attempt. They did it because they were afraid of what the alternative meant. 2 months after Iwo Jima, something much larger was beginning 60 miles south of Japan. The Battle of Okinawa, which began on April 1st, 1945, was by any measure the most ferocious land battle of the Pacific War. The island was 60 miles long. The Japanese 32nd Army, commanded by General Mitsuru Shijima, had dug in with a sophistication that made Iwo Jima's defenses look, in some respects, improvised. The Shuri Line, the main defensive belt that ran across the island's midsection, was anchored in ridge systems that had been carved, reinforced, and interconnected over months of preparation. Individual hills had multiple names because they had been attacked multiple times by different units who couldn't hold them. Sugarloaf Hill, Chocolate Drop, Conical Hill, Wanna Ridge, each one a knot of mutually supporting positions, each one requiring attackers to advance and to fire from 2 or 3 other hills at the same time, each one honeycombed with caves and tunnels for which defenders could be suppressed on one side and shift to the rock to emerge on another. The Marines and Army infantry who fought through the Shuri Line in April, May, and June of 1945 did so in rain that turned the coral hillsides into something approaching quicksand, in heat that followed the rain like a punishment for enduring the cold, and against a defense that yielded ground so grudgingly that entire battalions measured their advances in yards per week. The 713th Armored Flamethrower Battalion arrived on Okinawa as the only dedicated armored flamethrower unit in the entire United States Army. It had been created specifically for this. The 713th was converted from a 42nd Armor Regiment in August of 1944, stripped of its conventional tank equipment, and given less than 4 months to convert entirely to the flamethrower mission, train its crews on the new equipment, and embark for the Pacific. The men who filled those crew positions were not men who had been assigned to the job by accident or rotation. They understood at the minimum that they were volunteering for a weapon that combined the maximum danger of conventional tank, which was already a magnet for every anti-tank weapon on the battlefield, with the additional feature storing several hundred gallons of burning fuel directly adjacent to their bodies. They understood this, and they went. The crews of the 713th were mechanics and farmers and factory workers and school teachers from every part of America, and they shared one characteristic that is harder to describe than courage, which is a kind of professional clarity. They had looked at the weapon. They had looked at the problem it was meant to solve, and they had concluded that the arithmetic came out in favor of getting into the tank. Not because the risk was acceptable. It was not, by any actuarial standard, acceptable, but because the alternative was sending men with portable flamethrowers on their backs into positions that would kill them in 4 minutes. The 713th's Shermans were equipped with the E-4-5 auxiliary flamethrower mounted in the bow, not the turret-replacing mark, one of the Marine Zippos. This distinction matters less than it might seem. The principle was the same: armor delivery of sustained flame at close range. The fuel capacity and range varied by modification, but the tactical role was identical. Get the tank close enough to a cave entrance or bunker aperture to put fire into it, and hold that position long enough to ensure the job was done. Getting close enough was the operational problem. 150 yards sounds like a comfortable distance when you're reading it on a page. On the coral ridge lines of southern Okinawa, 150 yards was often the distance between the cave entrance you were trying to burn and the position you were taking fire from. It was a distance at which Japanese soldiers with satchel charges could close to your tank in the time it took to fire one burst and acquire a second target. It was a distance at which every defensive weapon from rifles to mortars to anti-tank guns had a clear shot at something that could not afford to absorb a penetrating hit to its fuel system. The crew of a Zippo or an armored flamethrower tank rolling up a contested ridge on Okinawa was In their own estimation, and in the estimation of every infantryman watching them, the bravest kind of fool or the most rational kind of hero, and the line between those things was too thin to see clearly from outside the turret hatch. Company B of the 713th went into its first combat on April 19, 1945, rolling south from the 7th Division's lines on the coastal flats, supporting the assault on the Shuri defenses. 2 medium tanks and 3 armored flamethrowers advanced through Uki toward the Japanese positions. The after-action report notes, with the compressed language of military documentation, that the tanks engaged numerous cave and bunker positions. What the after-action report does not fully convey is what this looked like from inside the tank. The narrowing of the world to what you could see through an aperture, the sound of your own engine competing with the sound of things striking your armor, the moment of reaching the right distance and firing and watching 150 yards of burning napalm find the mouth of a cave that you've been creeping toward for the last 3 minutes through concentrated defensive fire and having a hold position, while the fire does its work, while the infantry consolidates, while something you cannot see from inside the vehicle tries to find the angle that ends you. The 713th's crews learned quickly what the Marines on Iwo Jima had learned, that the Japanese defenders assigned a specific, immediate priority to destroying the flamethrower vehicles. Where a standard Sherman tank might draw fire from position and suppress it and push it back, the Zippo drew fire from positions that had not previously revealed themselves, because killing a flamethrower tank was worth the exposure. Japanese anti-tank teams that had held their fire through the approach of conventional armor would engage on the appearance of a flamethrower. This was tactically rational on their part and operationally terrifying on the crews. The response was combined arms in its most visceral form. The flamethrower tanks could not operate alone. Every Zippo advance needed infantry screens on both flanks. Standard gun tanks firing suppression on any position that could threaten the flamethrower's approach. Engineers standing by with demolition charges to follow the flame and seal positions permanently. The coordination required was intricate and constant, and in the chaos of close quarters fighting on ridge terrain that offered visibility measured in tens of yards. It broke down regularly. When it broke down, crews died, and when it held together, the results were like nothing else in Pacific. In the days around the assault on the Yeji, the final ridge complex in the southern part of Okinawa, where General Ushijima's 32nd Army had retreated after the fall of Shuri, the battlefield was, as the official history describes it, a coral plateau studded with rock formations, some the size of stumps, some large enough to anchor defensive positions. The Japanese had retreated from an organized offensive line into the scattered strongholds of a disintegrating army. But disintegrating armies in coral caves are still enormously dangerous. Each rock cluster might contain soldiers who would fight to the death. Each cave mouth might open onto a tunnel that ran 50 yards back and connected to 3 more positions. The 713th's armored flamethrowers were, in the official history's language, perfect for this terrain. The terrain was perfect for them in the specific sense that every problem the Pacific War had been presenting for 2 years was concentrated into this plateau, dispersed offensive positions in natural rock features, largely immune to artillery, requiring direct action at close range. And the solution that had been evolved through Bougainville and Saipan and Iwo Jima was now operating at full strength with full crew proficiency and full tactical integration. In 5 days from June 13th to June 17th, 1945, the armored flamethrowers of the 713th directed more than 37,000 gallons of burning gasoline at the enemy. Try to hold that number. 37,000 gallons, poured into caves, across ridge lines, into rock formations, through the openings of tunnel systems that had absorbed everything else the American military had thrown at them. The official history records, almost as an aside, a moment that captures what this meant in human terms. In one encounter, as a single armored flamethrower approached a position, 16 Japanese soldiers inside pressed grenades against their own bodies and detonated them simultaneously. 16 men, in one position, at the approach of one tank. They were not cowards. The Imperial Japanese Army had spent years conditioning its soldiers against the concept of surrender, against the concept of retreat, against any response to American attack except resistance and death. These were men who had absorbed that conditioning completely, who had demonstrated over weeks of fighting the most absolute commitment to their positions that any soldiers in the 20th century had shown. And when the flamethrower tank appeared, they chose the one form of death that was under their own control. What does that tell you about the weapon? There's a kind of evidence that doesn't appear in after-action reports. It appears in what the enemy didn't do. Japanese soldiers had surrendered on Okinawa in unprecedented numbers, 977, in a single day near the end of the battle, a number that stunned American intelligence officers who had planned on the assumption that surrender was effectively not a variable in their calculations. Historians have credited multiple factors: psychological warfare, the collapse of supply lines, the physical destruction of the organized command structure. All of this is true, but also true is this: the armored flamethrowers had spent weeks demonstrating, in the most visceral possible terms, the specific and irreversible nature of the alternative. When the Zippo came up the ridge, there were two choices, and only two. Defenders who held through artillery, aerial bombardment, and infantry assault found their calculation changed by a weapon that didn't offer cover, that didn't allow the deepest position to hold indefinitely, that followed you, in some sense, into the rock itself. The men sitting inside those tanks knew everything the enemy knew about what they were carrying. They knew that when Japanese anti-tank teams targeted them specifically, when soldiers charged their vehicles with satchel charges, when the enemy organized its entire defensive response around destroying the flamethrower before the flamethrower could operate, this was not random. This was a direct measurement of how much the other side feared what they could do. The 713th's crews did not celebrate this. The after-action reports and the letters home that survive from the men of the battalion share a quality that is common to men who have done necessary and terrible work: precision, specificity, a focus on mechanical and tactical details, on what worked and what failed and how to do it better next time. The rhetoric of heroism was largely absent. What was present was a professional's attention to the task. Sergeant Harold Finch, in a letter written to his family in Ohio from somewhere on Okinawa in May 1945, described his work in three sentences: the job is going well, we are advancing, and the new equipment is doing what it was designed to do. I am in good health, and the crew is good. He did not mention the fuel tanks. He did not mention the satchel charges. He did not mention what it meant to advance through a defensive zone where every anti-tank weapon was specifically looking for the type of tank he was driving. Some things a man writes around. When the flag went up over Okinawa's 10th Army headquarters on June 22nd, 1945, and the band played the Star-Spangled Banner in the morning light, the cost had been counted and was staggering. American total battle casualties on Okinawa exceeded 49,000. Japanese deaths exceeded 110,000. The campaign had lasted 83 days. The price of those 83 miles of coral was, by any measure, enormous. The 713th's specific contribution to that victory is difficult to isolate in any clean numerical sense. Flame tanks don't operate alone. Their effectiveness depended entirely on the infantry and gun tanks and engineers around them. But the official record offers one clear data point: more than 37,000 gallons of burning fuel directed at Japanese positions in 5 days. And the testimony of the men who fought alongside them, Marine officers, Army infantrymen, intelligence officers who processed the after-action reports, converges on the same conclusion that Captain Frank Caldwell had reached on Iwo Jima. The flame tank was the one thing that reached where nothing else could reach. The men of the 713th came home to a country that was celebrating the end of the war in the Pacific and trying, understandably, to put the whole thing behind it as quickly as possible. The battalion was deactivated. The tanks were scrapped or mothballed. The crews went back to Ohio and Kansas and Georgia and took up jobs that required no explanation of what they had done: hardware stores, farm equipment, insurance, the ordinary business of American life in the post-war years, which was partly defined by the collective agreement not to examine too closely what the war had required. The flamethrower tank lingered in military inventory through Korea and Vietnam, modified and updated but recognizable. The M67 Zippo saw service in Vietnam, where its crews discovered that the same tactical logic that had applied on Okinawa applied in the tunnels and fortified villages of Southeast Asia. The weapon could be improved, made more reliable, fitted with better navigation and communication systems. The essential fact of it could not be changed. Someone had to be inside it, and inside it meant sitting on the fuel. The last American flamethrower tank was retired in 1978. The decision was officially justified on technical and doctrinal grounds. Unofficially, there was also the growing international legal and ethical framework around incendiary weapons, which made flamethrower tanks politically complicated in a way that they hadn't been when the only consideration was whether they worked. They worked. That was never the question. The question, in 1978 and before and after, was always the other one, the one the crews of the 713th answered every time they climbed into their vehicles and pulled the hatch shut behind them. Not whether the weapon was effective, not whether the tactical situation justified it. The question of whether you, specifically you, would be the man willing to sit inside 290 gallons of napalm and drive toward people who wanted to destroy you by any means available, because the men who would otherwise have to approach those cave entrances on foot had a life expectancy measured in minutes, and the arithmetic of that calculation came out the same way every morning. For the crews of the 713th, the answer was never in doubt. They climbed in, they fired, they went back for more fuel, and climbed in again. They called it a coffin on tracks. They weren't wrong, but they also weren't fools, and they weren't blind, and they weren't ignorant of what they were doing. They understood the problem, they understood the cost, and they understood in the specific and clear-headed way of men who looked at an ugly calculation and resolved it that the machine they sat inside was a lesser horror. The caves it destroyed never open again.